Hello everyone, thanks for coming to this talk. So I've been given the honor to introduce Mark Diesendorf, who is probably very familiar to you. I looked at his biography and I found it got a bit dizzy when I looked at it, so I had to cut it down to some things. So Mark has worked for 3 decades,
10 seconds.
more than 3 decades in this field. He's been working as CSIRO, as principal scientist. He is director of the Institute, co-founder and director of the Institute for Sustainable Futures. He came to UNSW in 2004. He retired in 2016 just to be back here and do what he really loves doing. So please put your hands together for Mark.
Well, thanks very much, Oliver. I'm going to bust a few myths about renewable energy. You've been hearing these myths on the radio, television, from our great leaders. And in the course of busting these myths, I'm going to assert that, in fact, 100% renewable electricity is entirely feasible technically and economically, and, of course, environmentally. And the main barriers are primarily political and cultural and so on. So, here we go. First thing is to remind you that we use energy in 3 ways. We use it as electricity, as in this room. We use it in the form of transportation energy, and we use it as non-electrical heat. And I think that covers pretty well everything, although I probably overlooked something. At present, 63% of our electricity is still generated from coal, but 20 years ago it was more like 80%. So we're getting there slowly. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, we could run the whole of Australia and the US and Europe and many other regions of the world entirely on renewable electricity, and that electricity can also provide for most transport and most heat, industrial and residential heat, that is currently produced by fuels. The main challenges at present are in the transport sector are with air transport and sea transport. And in these cases, we will have to produce renewable fuels, liquid fuels or gaseous fuels, and we can do that actually using renewable electricity. So a renewable energy future will mostly be an electrical future. First point. Okay. Global investment in electricity last year in renewables, $265 billion equivalent, plus 45 for large-scale hydro. So if you add that together, you can see that it is more than double the combined fossil fuel and nuclear power investment during 2017, which added up only to $145 billion. The point of this slide is that renewable energy is mainstream. It is not alternative energy. So please don't refer to it anymore as alternative energy. I also have concerns, while we're talking about terminology, about talking about clean energy, because this term was created by the nuclear industry so they could include nuclear power alongside renewable energy. It is anything but clean. In Australia, renewables last year provided 17% of our electricity, and hydro and wind are now making equal contributions to electricity, each contributing about 1/3. I won't go through this slide, but the Clean Energy Council produced it to show the number of new jobs in investment in Australia, and they're very impressive, and this slide is already out of date, although it was only published a few months ago. Okay, now Australia is blessed with a huge diversity of renewable energy sources. Many different sites are possible. In the pictures there, 2 of those technologies are not yet commercially available, and that is hot rock geothermal and wave power. They're still really at the demonstration stage. But apart from that, we've got CST, concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, or we have the potential for it hugely. Solar PV, of course, wind, existing hydro, bioenergy, and in the middle, a form of hydro that is relatively new still to Australia. Well, Tumut 3 actually has a pumped hydro system, but pumped hydro of the conventional kind is fairly limited geographically, and as Andrew Blake has pointed out here a few weeks ago, what is new is off-river pumped hydro, and it can be off-river if the lower reservoir is the ocean, or it can be a mine shaft, and so on. And according to the research by Blakers and his group, there is a huge potential for off-river pumped hydro, and it can complement batteries because batteries are very expensive if you want to store lots of energy. They're fantastic for rapid response, millisecond response, but if you want to store lots of energy for periods of days and weeks, then pumped hydro is the cheapest way to go. Okay, now there are 4 ways, as I've framed it, for achieving 100% renewable electricity. And the first way on this slide is well known. It has been achieved or almost achieved many years ago, and that is for regions that have lots of hydro, lots of potential for big dams, or in some cases geothermal. So we're talking about Norway, Iceland, New Zealand, Bhutan, Tasmania, and quite a few other places. So that is straightforward. It's not too hard to go to 100% renewable electricity there, and the only concern is the occasional incidence of droughts, which can be a problem. Okay, so this is easy. The second way is that if you can go to 100% renewables if your country or state has strong connections with its neighbours, strong transmission links with its neighbours. Denmark is currently on 44% wind. It's strongly connected to Norway, where there's huge hydro storage. Scotland is 68% renewable energy, mostly wind with a little bit of hydro, strongly connected to England. The ACT here in Australia is well on track to 100% renewable electricity by 2020. It's of course strongly connected to New South Wales, but it might also belong in the next category that we'll come to. And 2 North German states, Schleswig-Holstein and Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, I've been practicing, they are on 100% renewable electricity net, and mostly wind, and the net means that if there isn't enough wind, they buy electricity from their neighbours, and if there's too much, they sell it across. So this form of 100% renewables, variable renewables with strong interconnections, has become pretty well routine recently. That's trivial. Now, a variant of this is if we have a region or a business that might install some of its own renewables on site, but can also purchase renewables in the various ways through power purchase agreements and other ways from elsewhere. So the ACT fits in that category as well, because most of its wind farms are in Victoria and South Australia, for example, but they count that electricity. You can see the Google data center there on the left. Google worldwide is now 100% renewable electricity. It's not all on site, obviously, they buy in the rest. Tesla also, you can see the gigafactory there under construction in the US. It's going to be totally powered by renewables, wind and solar, but mostly solar. And this is quite important because we're talking about making effectively a renewable energy technology, batteries in this case, with renewable energy. So, and we'll come back to this is known as renewable energy breeding. So renewable energy can breed more renewable energy. In Australia, we have a number. This slide is way behind actual developments, but Sun Metals has built its own 124 megawatt solar farm to provide a third of its electricity for a zinc refinery, and it's operating. Whyalla Steelworks, owned by the billionaire Sanjeev Gupta, is planning 1 gigawatt of solar plus various forms of storage, and BlueScope Steel, which publicly tries to put down renewable energy, is going to buy 88 megawatts from a new solar farm for the Port Kembla Steelworks. So it goes, and they've announced that recently. Okay, so that's fairly easy too, and that's starting to happen, and it'll happen faster and faster because in many regions now, as you know, solar and some cases wind is a lot cheaper than either buying from the grid or having diesel in a remote area. Okay, the fourth case is the more challenging one, where you've got variable renewables, mostly wind and solar, for example, local generation, and weak interconnections with your neighbours, or none at all. So in this category, we've got the national electricity market. It'll be some time before it's connected to Asia, for example, maybe never. We've got SWIS, the Southwest Integrated System in Western Australia. I suppose I can use this little pointer, so that's over there. Oh no, that was a big mistake. Go back. We've got the USA, which hasn't got terribly strong connections to its neighbours. And the question then is raised, well, can a system based predominantly on variable renewables operate and reach 100% renewables in a way in which it's reliable and the system is secure and, of course, affordable? And so I'll mainly focus on that. But before doing so, we have several requirements for an electricity system, and we've heard the government talk about reliability and affordability. Another concept that is mentioned less often is security, that I'll mention in a moment, which is not quite the same as reliability, although it's related. And then we're not hearing a lot of mention from the government about ecological sustainability, but I'm going to suggest that everything has to be embedded in a system that is ecologically sustainable. And that means renewable energy and, of course, energy efficiency, which is not the subject of this seminar. So, unfortunately, we have what I would call renewable energy deniers, some of whom are climate science deniers and some of whom accept the climate science but support nuclear energy. And they're using very similar tactics, misleading tactics, as climate science deniers to now attack renewable energy. And I'm going to look at some of the principal myths. And I've listed 4 main myths there. There are many more, but these are the ones probably we hear most about. The first is that we need so-called baseload power stations in a large-scale grid. And they can be either coal or nuclear, or if you have cheap gas, as South Australia once did somewhere in the distant past, they could be gas boiler systems. Or in Tasmania, you've got so much hydro that hydro is baseload. So baseload simply means they can operate 24/7 except when they break down or have planned maintenance. So that's probably the main myth, and we hear it all the time. Another variant of this myth that has gradually faded away is that baseload power stations must run continuously as backup for variable renewable energy. And that myth is pretty hard to sustain because we are now seeing a situation in South Australia where we've got about 50% annual average renewable electricity from variable sources, wind and PV. The only nominal baseload station is Torrens Island, which is a gas boiler station, and it is not operating as baseload now. It will soon pass on. Another myth is that renewable energy, variable renewable energy, needs vast amounts of expensive electrical storage. And we can easily show that, in fact, the amount of storage we need in the system is relatively small, both in power capacity and in energy storage. And then the final myth, which sort of isn't very rarely stated explicitly, except by some academics who are campaigners for nuclear power, and the myth is that every power station in a large-scale system must be dispatchable. Well, that really would rule out solar and wind. So we're now at a stage where these myths can actually be refuted by practical experience to some degree. because grids like Denmark, Germany, South Australia actually do operate for short periods of time already on 100% renewables. So in fact, in 2016, the Danish system operated for 317 hours in 1 year entirely on renewables. These were not continuous hours, right? They might have been periods of several days at a time. So the practical experience is catching up with the myths, but of course what we don't have is predominant grids with predominantly variable renewables, wind and solar PV, with weak interconnections to their neighbours that operate 100% of the time on variable renewables. The other way of tackling these myths is through computer simulations, and in these simulations we can balance every hour or half hour or whatever, we can balance real data on demand with real data on wind and solar. And this is just what has been done around the world and in Australia by 8 different groups already, using different assumptions, different mixes of renewable energy. So starting with Wright and Herbst from Beyond Zero Emissions back in 2010, they did a single simulation, 2 years of half-hourly data, and they chose their mix so they would have lots of storage in it. They chose lots of concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, which is currently the most expensive source to choose. Well, that stimulated our lot here at New South Wales, and a then PhD student, Ben Elliston, supervised by Ian McGill and myself, built our own model, which is called NEMO, and we did a series of simulations of 100% renewable electricity in the national electricity market based on our actual hourly data, initially 1 year and then extending to 6 years. Following that, Manfred Lenson and colleagues from Sydney University and elsewhere did their own simulations, and then Andrew Blakers, who spoke 2 or 3 weeks ago here, used a variant of NEMO. NEMO, by the way, is open source, so it's available to anyone to use. Okay, so, and I should say, and on some of these simulations, the capital costs and operating costs of all the technologies were inserted, and we could actually calculate an economic optimal mix of renewables. And so this is what a typical week in summer looks like. This is supply and demand for 7 days, and the different colours are the different renewable energy technologies. So solar PV is the dark blue, green is wind, yellow is concentrated solar thermal with thermal storage, light blue is existing hydro. We didn't put any more hydro in the system. So these were the early simulations, and the dotted line across cuts off at the maximum demand, and the bits that you can see going above that is excess renewable energy that is actually lost or curtailed. But that can be used, as we'll see. So a typical week is easy, although you'll notice on the left-hand side there's a little pink bit in the supply, and that is a gap. Sunshine was poor on that day, wind wasn't great, so we had to fill the gap with something. And for the early simulations, we used gas turbines running on renewable fuels. And it turns out that they hardly ever have to be used anyway during the year. This was the worst period in 2010, the 6 days, and you can see there's a fair bit of pink stuff on the left and also on the right. So here, where we're using, oh, I did it again, sorry. I can't click, I just have to point. And over here on this side, you can also see a bit. So that was the gap filler. But of course, nowadays, we would envisage the gap being filled probably not by gas turbines or only temporarily, and more reasonably by a mix of batteries and off-river pumped hydro, and actual on-river pumped hydro where it already exists. Okay, so, and this was the optimal mix as we calculated by doing thousands of simulations basically, so it wasn't an optimization program. in 2010. And you can see wind provided 46% of the annual electricity, PV 20%, and then there's a few other things. So the first thing that struck us was, because at that time, almost everyone, including us, was assuming that we would need some baseload power stations in this system. And here we had a system which was reliable, so all our simulations have to meet the reliability criterion of the NEM, and 2/3 of the annual energy is coming from variable renewables. So how's that possible? Well, these variable renewables are balanced with what we call dispatchable renewables. They can supply power on demand because they have some storage associated with it. CST, existing hydro, which was 6% in that year, and biofuel gas turbines, which was 6%. So that got us very excited, as you can imagine. We didn't have a huge amount of storage in the system, and we're still getting a reliable system. So just to discuss the reliability a bit more. So the key source of the reliability is balancing lots of variable renewable energy with a smaller proportion of flexible, dispatchable renewable energy technologies or other forms of storage if you want to put batteries in or compressed air. That's the key, but the other things that increase and strengthen the reliability is having a diversity of renewable energy technologies. So if your variable renewables were all wind, as is pretty well the case in Northern Europe, it's more difficult. Or if it's all solar, if you're in the tropical area of the world where there isn't much wind. So diversity of technology is important. Geographic diversity of wind and solar is very important. You spread out your wind farms and solar farms, and immediately the fluctuations become much smaller. And we did some simulations to show that. If you've got geographic diversity of wind and solar farms, you may need one or two key transmission links to be built. Transmission is a bit slow and it is quite expensive, but often building a transmission link has other values, particularly in the NEM, which is this long 5,000 kilometre long line, and putting in the odd cross link, like joining South Australia to New South Wales, can be argued on many grounds. And the other thing I haven't mentioned, of course, that is getting increasing attention is smart demand response. So shrinking the peaks by demand response through contracts and so on. A more recent paper was produced by Ben Elliston, Jenny Rees and Ian McGill, and there's a lot in this diagram, and I'll just go through it really quickly. So what this shows is we're plotting the share of electrical energy against the fraction of renewable energy. So we're starting from 0 on the left, which is the current situation, and the dark stuff is coal, and the blue stuff on the top is hydro, and you can see the green is a little bit of wind. And we go across to the right-hand side, which is 100%. And in these calculations, these simulations, each of those steps increasing renewable energy share, each of those steps is an optimal mix. So we optimize the mix at each time. And this is drawing on pre-2016 data. So at that time, wind was still much cheaper than PV. And that's why you see much greater proportion coming from wind than from PV. So wind is the green, PV is the yellow in the 100% mix. And then down the bottom here, you've got some concentrated solar thermal and some gas turbines, and that's about it, providing the reliability. So each of those steps is reliable, and it's an optimal mix, where you put optimization in quotes because we haven't used an optimization program. We've actually just done thousands of simulations for each step and taken the lowest costs. So it sounds a bit crude, but Ben Elliston designed his program so well so that you can go through a whole year of data, hourly data, in a tiny fraction of a second. So Now, the other thing to note in this diagram are the black dots running across. And these are the costs of the system based on the prices pre-2016 prices. And you can see that going from 0 to 80%, there is only a very slight increase in cost. And then beyond that, going to 100%, the cost does increase, but you can still see it's less than $80 per megawatt hour. It's more like $77 per megawatt hour. Now again, I think that was $15 or something like that. So this is not an expensive mix. Okay, let's talk about some more myths now. So we don't need base load. We don't need loads of storage in the system. What about the affordability? And we have some lovely myths trotted out almost every time a minister is interviewed. One of the myths is, well, misleading statements, let me put it this way, is South Australia has the highest electricity prices in Australia. The statement is actually true most of the time, although there were times when Queensland overtook it, and Queensland has very little renewable energy. It's true, but it's grossly misleading because South Australia has always had the highest electricity prices in Australia long before it had any renewable energy, and that's because it was largely dependent, and still is to a large degree, on gas. And gas is expensive, and as you know, in recent years, gas has become very expensive, tripling the price of gas. You know, it used to be $3 a gigajoule, and $3 a gigajoule. It's now 9 or more, because exports have pulled up that price. The same attack has been made on Denmark, because Denmark has been so successful with renewable electricity, and the standard statement again is Denmark has one of the highest electricity prices in Europe. It's a true statement, but what the stater does not inform you is that Denmark's high electricity price are the result of a very high tax that it has on electricity, and that tax goes into consolidated revenue. It does not specifically subsidise renewable energy, but it provides for general revenue for the government. And if you compare electricity prices in Europe without the taxes, then Denmark's in the middle. So it goes. The other thing that has to be said about affordability is that in both regions, the presence of a large contribution from variable renewables, or renewables generally, actually reduces the wholesale price of electricity below what it would be otherwise. And that's explained in the next slide. And I've taken a slide from Germany, which actually has nuclear in the system, but I was in a hurry and I'm very slow to do my own slides. So the top slide shows the market in Germany before there was a lot of renewables, apart from hydro. They have some hydro in the system. And I just have to explain in a few sentences how the market actually works. So every 5 minutes or so, power stations bid a price to operate into the grid. And the lowest price, which is called the top of the merit order, gets the top priority to operate, and it goes in, and you can see hydro there. It has the lowest price. It could be 0 actually. And then the next cheapest to operate is, in Germany, is nuclear, and then the next cheapest is coal, and the next cheapest is gas. And assuming that you need some gas as well to meet the demand for the next 5 minutes, then the price paid to all the generators is the highest price. It's the price that gas gets. And the purpose of that is to help pay off the capital costs of their investment. Now, what happens today is, of course, you've got a lot of these so-called intermittent renewables down here with almost zero operating costs. Obviously, they have no fuel cost if they're wind and PV. There is a small operation and maintenance cost, so they can effectively bid 0 into the market. And then, because they basically displace, in this case, in this diagram, they've displaced all of gas and most of coal. So the final price then is this price, because there's still a bit of coal operating in the system, the price has been reduced. That's the wholesale price. Obviously, the price we see in our houses has to also include the cost of transmission, distribution and retailing. So we pay a lot more than the wholesale price. So basically, wind and solar reduce the wholesale price of electricity, and it is fundamental to the operation of an electricity market. And so when we hear these statements on the radio, we can't have all that wind and solar, it's going to cost us the earth. Well, in fact, in the present system, it's actually reducing the price. And that actually, in the long run, is going to have a problem, because when you have getting close to 100% renewables, your wholesale price will drop to almost zero. And you might think, oh, that's a good thing, but then how do you pay for the capital costs of the technologies? Anyway, that's something to think about. Okay, now another myth is not so common, but basically the myth stated is, well, if we transition to renewable energy, then we're going to create a lot of greenhouse gas emissions during the transition. So it isn't really worth the trouble. One way or the other, the greenhouse gas emissions in mining the materials and constructing the renewable energy technologies are going to make the whole transition idea not worthwhile. Okay, so this is a study done by another PhD student, Bahare Sarah Howard, supervised by Tommy Wiedman and myself, and with a big input by Nick Hamilton. And we're all from different schools at this university, interestingly enough. And what we're showing here is we're plotting the cumulative emissions starting at a particular date, like 2011 or 2015, and then going up to 2050. What are the cumulative emissions in transitioning? And we're taking into account the full life cycle emissions. So the emissions resulting from mining the raw materials and building the power stations and so on. But and you'd think, well, that is a bit of a worry, but then there is at least a partial offset for those emissions, because as time goes on, increasingly, we use more and more renewable energy to make the renewable energy systems and to mine the materials, as we can see with the mining example I gave, where the zinc mining company has actually built its own wind farm. Okay, so here you can see 22 scenarios. Some of those scenarios are for partial or total transitions of the electricity system. Some of those scenarios are produced by other authors, and some of them are our own scenarios. And you can see that red horizontal line, that is the emissions level that Australia has to keep under if it is to meet its share of the global carbon budget from electricity alone. So that's a bit of a tricky concept. So as you know, it's been calculated that although we've got all this fossil fuel still in the ground, we can only afford to burn a certain budget of it globally before we can lift the temperature to a certain level. So the red line, the red horizontal line, is the 2 degree level globally, or for Australia, assuming very conservatively that Australia's emissions are 1% or 1.5% of global emissions, and then electricity is 35% of that. So it's a very conservative comparison, and all the red region, all the scenarios that are in the red fail to meet even our share of the 2 degree C budget. And sadly, although we tried really hard, not one of our scenarios quite met the 1.5 degree budget. And the one that came closest, this one labelled as V down here, almost did it. That involved a transition to 98% renewable electricity by 2030, and a reduction in demand by 35% compared with business as usual. Well, I don't think we've got much chance of getting that. So that's the sad news from that study. But so the conclusions for that study, which was only published a few months ago, is that we absolutely need a rapid transition if we in Australia are to make our share of the global carbon budget. All this talk about a 26% target, which has been agreed to, is completely trivial. We need to go to 100% by 2030 if we are to be serious and do our share. The good news is that the emissions from building the renewable energy technologies are much, much less than the emissions saved by substituting renewables for fossil fuels for that generation. So that's the good news. And then further good news is that renewable energy breeding helps. It helps a lot, particularly in the later years, getting towards 2050, or if we have a faster transition, 2030. All right, I think I'm nearly done. Very quickly. All right, I'll just go through this and then maybe make some time for questions and discussion. Vaclav Smil is a very eminent historian of energy transitions. And he has studied all the earlier transitions, going from wood to oil to coal to uranium and so on. And based on his studies, he believes that energy transitions will take several generations, because in the past they have. So I had a look at his latest book, and basically, because he's claiming that transition to renewable energy, which he does not oppose, has to take several generations. But he has a number of assumptions underlying that, and he's actually exposed the assumptions. So the first of these is that most of the renewable energy targets that he's seen in the literature apply only to electricity generation, which is true, but I would argue doesn't matter, because a renewable energy future will be mostly a renewable electricity future. A related argument from Smil is that, we can change the sources of electricity, but how do we change the makeup of primary fuel supply? And the diagram shows primary energy in Australia when it is burnt, when coal, oil or gas are burnt to produce electricity. And as you can see, 2/3 or more of the energy is lost between the primary source and the electricity that I'm using for this show. Something like typically about 70% is lost. So the answer to Smil's concern is that by saving 1 unit of electricity, you can save more than 3 units of primary fuel burnt. And it's at the primary end the greenhouse gas emissions are made. And we can go better than that, because as you can see, on the right-hand side of electricity is energy services. And an energy service is a warm house in winter or cold food in the fridge. And by changing the services to incorporate a much larger amount of energy efficiency, you can further reduce the demands on primary fuel. So those objections of Smil don't really hold. I'll just go through one more, and that is that he says that wind and solar must be scaled up by increasing the size of generating units, but size limits are being reached. And it's true for wind power, we are getting close to size limits, although they've gone surprisingly far for offshore wind. But it is not true that scaling up the size of individual units is what's been pulling the price down of wind and solar. The continuing cost reductions are actually coming from more and more mass production on a larger and larger scale by expanding the market, and in the course of doing that, improving the supply chains. There's also, of course, valuable contribution from research and development, which this university is very prominent in. But the main cost reductions are coming from increasing mass production, not from making bigger wind turbines or bigger solar modules. So at least I can say that the arguments that Smil gives are based on false assumptions. Now, I would say that the main barrier is, of course, political barriers and the power of the fossil fuel industries in particular. I'm going to skip over security because we're just about out of time. You might have heard of the former National Energy Guarantee, which was concocted in order to placate Tony, who's pictured there on the right-hand side. And it would actually have held back renewable energy, in my view, and prolonged coal power. But that didn't affect Tony because it wasn't really about that, apparently. And there's a fantastic myth-busting video, a short one, that you must look up if you haven't seen. Look up honest government ad and you will be entertained. Okay, so to conclude, what do we need, in my view, from the a future federal government, I should probably say? And we don't need an egg. An egg would be a backward step. We first need the government to get out of the way and to stop undermining investor confidence in renewables, because the economics are fantastic. We do need, to help investor confidence, we do need renewable energy targets. Maybe 60% by 2030 would be nice. It's quite feasible. But as I said, the science suggests we need 100% by 2030. But even starting on a 60% target would get us going. The LNP has a target of 25%, or is it 26%? The ALP has a target of 50% by 2030. The Greens have a target of 100%, but they don't specify the year. We also, in order to do this, there's one thing in which I think the federal government is right. We do need some energy generation technology that is dispatchable to balance the variables in wind. But the last thing we need is coal, which is terribly inflexible in operation. What we need is dispatchable renewables and other forms of storage. So I'm suggesting that we have an increase in funding for the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, several $1 billion, maybe $4 billion over 4 years would be nice. The LNP policy is to close the CEFC. They still have legislation sitting in the Senate that they can't pass. The ALP has a very dangerous policy on the CEFC. It is to make it technology neutral. And that could mean anything. It could mean putting lots of money into carbon capture and storage, which is really a failed pathway. Now, CEFC gives loans, and in order for some of these dispatchable technologies in their early stages to actually break even, we will need some grants to supplement that in the early years, and that's why ARENA should get some more funding too. LNP policy is to close ARENA. The ALP has a moderate policy of $270 million over 4 years specifically for CEFC. And then last but not least, we need partial federal funding along with the states for 1 or 2 new interstate transmission lines. And I'll skip that and I'll say thanks very much for listening so patiently. The research paper on busting the myths is available in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews. And for those who haven't got a background in sustainable energy, plug for my old textbook. Okay, thanks very much. And I'm sorry I took longer than I planned, but I'm happy to try and answer questions. So with a bit of luck, we might get a few questions in before we get thrown out. Well, yes, please.
What's your thoughts about if the government continues to stall for the state to try and push the state to go alone like Victoria has?
I think the states are doing, well, some of the states are doing a fantastic job. Yeah. So Victoria, it looks like, is has just held a reverse auction for large-scale renewables, for which close to $1 billion worth of investment seems to be coming out of. So that's very exciting, and they have quite a good target. Queensland too, we're seeing lots of solar and some wind being built in Queensland. even though Queensland is not actually a windy state. And it's fantastic news that the Liberal government in South Australia has recognised that there's such strong public support for renewable energy there that they are carrying on the previous Labor government's policies in South Australia, or in a slightly modified form. So there's some good things in those 3 states. The ACT will hit 100% renewables, but it's a net thing, and it's counting some of its wind and solar farms outside, of course, the ACT. The Northern Territory is starting also with a target and some policies, particularly to encourage solar. The big gap is New South Wales and Western Australia. A bit disappointing. However, the market is still pushing solar developments in New South Wales, even without state government strong support from the state government in New South Wales. And I haven't really caught up with the latest in Western Australia, but not much seems to be happening there. And of course Tasmania is pretty close to 100% renewables already, but it needs more wind to balance its large hydro, so that when there are droughts in the future, the wind can play a bigger role. Yes?
Mark, thanks for your talk. I'm interested in your comments on seasonal energy storage.
Yes.
And whether it makes sense to install extra photovoltaic and wind generators to compensate for seasonal variations, or if perhaps there's another solution to that.
Okay, I don't think we need seasonal storage in Australia. I looked through all the old solar data, and although during the course of a year the months when you get the most solar tends to move around, in most years when you add up the solar contribution it's much the same. And I went back about, 15, 20 years, it's much the same. So seasonal storage, and of course wind, you do get some years where wind isn't as good as others, but I think with pumped hydro, with concentrated solar thermal, I think that the need for seasonal storage has been exaggerated. It is much more important in Northern Europe, obviously, where you have very little sunshine for a large part of the year, although you do have generally a lot of wind. So the people who are more preoccupied with seasonal storage are the Europeans, the Northern Europeans in particular. But there are other things that can be done. And one of the things that particularly in Northern Europe they're talking about, and in the UK, is power to gas. So you can use excess renewables to split water, to produce hydrogen. You can combine the hydrogen with nitrogen from the atmosphere to get ammonia, which is much easier to handle than hydrogen. You can put hydrogen as it is up to a certain percentage, I think about 10% into the gas pipelines with gas, but beyond that it starts to escape. So in Europe there is much more talk about power to gas as well. So I mean, this goes with the understanding that having a lot of excess renewable capacity doesn't really matter. Once you can capture that excess wind and solar when it really is generating, turn it into a fuel, a gaseous fuel or a liquid fuel, and that's going to have to be done anyway for air transport in particular and sea transport. It's an amazing achievement for a single-seater aircraft to fly around the world on solar, but there's no way a jumbo jet is going to be able to do that carrying hundreds of people. They need a fuel. And so renewable fuels are not as advanced as renewable electricity, but we can do an enormous amount with renewable electricity in the meantime. Yes?
Maybe I missed it, but it didn't seem like you mentioned much about demand-side management technologies. Do you see any role for them to sort of take up those pink areas in the first few?
Yes, very important. I did skip over them because, as you could see, there really wasn't time. So I was focusing mainly on energy supply, but contracted demand response is looking very promising, and there are some projects developing even in this country, and I see it playing a very important role, particularly during peaks in demand, in reducing the peaks in demand. And I mean, you can sign a contract, so a customer can sign a contract with an electricity supplier from the grid that basically, the contract could be that if they agree to limit their demand on the grid during system peaks in demand, that their daily supply charge is reduced by 50% or something like that. So there's all sorts of potential contracts that can be done that would, because most of the challenges are not base load, they're peak load. The challenge is during the peaks very often, in the peaks of demand. And demand response can play a very important role. And of course, there's a whole separate topic then also on energy efficiency and the role that it can play, because it is so cheap and fast to implement. So yes, it needs very serious, not just consideration, but implementation as fast as possible. And some virtual power plants that are being planned are going to use demand response as an important part of their portfolio. They won't just be supplying electricity.
I think we are running out of time because the room booking runs out at 2. So maybe if you want to ask more questions, maybe we can have a few more questions outside if you're willing to take some more questions. Yeah, thanks to the speaker again, thanks.